Hi, my name is Vicki Ellis and I am the Executive Director of Heritage Ranch Christian Children's Home. And today I'm going to be talking to you about parenting styles, specifically the punitive approach to parenting. And I just want to let you know that if you haven't seen my first video in this series, which is about how your parenting styles are formed, I'd love for you to check that out. It will help you and be informative coming into the start of this video. If not, you can just dive right into this content and check it out later. So parenting styles vary, and there are 4 typical approaches that people talk about, and those are punitive, permissive, mixed, and democratic. Now, you may have heard them called a lot of different things, sometimes authoritative or autocratic or different things, but for the purpose of today, I am going to be referencing them as punitive, permissive, mixed, and democratic. So, our parenting styles are typically pretty consistent in our interactions with our kids. If we tend towards being punitive, then you're usually going to find us being punitive most of the time. That being said, sometimes they may shift depending on if we are feeling stressed or if we are in a really good mood. I don't know about you, but I find that with my kids, sometimes I hear, "Mom, I know you're just being like that because you had a really hard day at work," or "You're just doing that because you're really upset." And while I don't like hearing that from my kids, the reality is we do need to be aware that our parenting styles and our behaviors can change because of our mood. So typically though, you are going to have a default parenting style. And so for the purpose of this video series, what I want you to really do is start to critically evaluate that parenting style and kind of assess if you need to learn a new style that will be more effective. I can tell you that for the purpose of this series, our goal is going to be to shift any parenting style that is not democratic to the democratic style. So when I'm talking today, for example, about punitive parenting and that approach, then I will be referencing that it isn't the ideal style that I would suggest you use with your kids, or that best practice kind of education on this area would recommend. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about the punitive approach. And so during this video, my goal is going to be to help you in identifying if this is your primary style and to highlight some of its drawbacks. And so this will be a really good starting place for you to work from, with my recommended goal being that you are going to shift to a democratic approach over time. And in my upcoming videos, you'll be able to learn more about that approach. So I hope that you will check out all the videos that I'm doing on this topic. But for the purpose of today, I want to delve into the punitive approach. So when you think about punitive parenting and that style, the first thing that you want to know is that that approach is considered firm, but not necessarily respectful. So parents who use the punitive approach often find themselves in the roles of police detective, judge, referee, and probation officer. Typically, parents direct and control the problem-solving process, which tends to be loud, angry, and adversarial. Cooperation, when you're using the punitive approach, is typically achieved through fear, threats, and intimidation. It really creates what is a win-lose dynamic, where typically the parents win and the kids lose. If you're using the punitive approach, it's usually going to look a lot like you using the fact that you are in the authority role as the parent to dictate to your child that they really are going to do what you say they're going to do no matter what. So the underlying belief when using the punitive approach is that discipline needs to, quote, kind of hurt children or be painful to children before they can learn from it. So methods typically used if you're approaching parenting from a punitive direction is going to be a lot of like interrogating, a lot of criticism, Often there's blaming, and to the extreme, it's not that you're just grounding or taking away things, it's that you're taking away things for kind of weeks at a time even. And what your goal is, if you're using the punitive approach, is really that you want the kids to feel like they're suffering so that they will really learn. So the question that we have to ask ourselves if we defer to the punitive approach is, how do children usually respond to punitive discipline? So I can tell you this, if you have a child that's typically compliant, all kids have different personality types and kind of the ways they respond, but a compliant child will usually cooperate out of fear or intimidation. So you will see typically, if you're using a punitive approach, cooperation if your children are compliant. Now, if you have a strong-willed child, then often they are going to respond with rebellion or retaliation. And if you have a kid that, I'm gonna just call it for this sake, a fence sitter, that kind of is compliant sometimes and is really strong-willed sometimes, they're gonna do a little bit of both. So one of the things with the punitive approach is that it does have a lot of limitations in terms of its effectiveness long-term. Now, if you're using this approach, it will typically stop the misbehavior eventually, but it doesn't at the core teach kids about responsibility or problem solving. What it does is it puts the parent in a position where they are making all the decisions, giving all the directives and saying basically this is how it's going to be. And so the parent is in the position of doing all the problem solving or figuring out like what's going to happen. And so if you use this approach, then your kids aren't going to be put in the position where they are being collaborative in the process of communication, and they are likely to not take personal responsibility because they're not being given choices. Really, you're telling them what to do and they're going to do it, and you're going to hear a lot of like that's your fault or such forth. So what you want to do instead is understand that your goal should be engaging your kids and not doing so. One of the biggest things that can happen with punitive parenting is really that it can create communication with your kid to the point of it feeling hurtful or really kind of dividing that relationship because your child doesn't feel like they have a say-so or that they can talk to you or give feedback, because what a kid expects is like, dad or mom says this is the way it is and this is the way it is, so it doesn't really matter what I think and feel. And so that is not the position that we want to be in as parents. Now, I'll tell you this about the punitive approach. It can work, but the reality is it usually works best for kids who don't really need you to use a specific approach. So, compliant kids by nature have an underlying desire to please and cooperate. So if you're punitive, then they're going to want to please and cooperate no matter what. So you can use that style and get a response. The issue is just that it's not going to be productive in your communication with them. And again, as I said before, if you have a strong-willed child, then it really is often going to make them very angry and often create resentment and incite them to retaliate because they don't feel like there's any space for them to have a voice about anything. And so you may get the cooperation of your kids, but it comes at really kind of a high price of potentially injured feelings, damaged relationships, and a lot of power struggles and anger. And so one thing I really want you to consider is that a lot of parents who use the punitive approach were raised that way themselves. So I don't want it to sound like I'm saying like this is bad and just harmful, but the reality is what we need to recognize is that if this is the way you were parented, then often it feels really natural and you won't necessarily think about the effectiveness of it. When things break down, it's very common that you'll assume the problem is with your child and not with your method. So I just really want to encourage you to think a lot about if you are using a punitive approach to parenting, if you find yourself when your kids are doing something, getting into a lot of power struggles where you're telling your kids, you should do it because I said so, if when they do something wrong, you're using really lengthy consequences, and you're usually typically very emotional, and you're getting angry and you're not in good self-control, all of these are signs that you're likely using punitive parenting. And so what I want you to challenge yourself to do is to identify, how are you feeling when you're parenting? Because if you're parenting out of your own emotion, and that emotion is frustration, anger, and really a need for control to get your child to do something, then you're probably using punitive parenting. I'm going to be again doing a video on democratic parenting in the rest of this series later on, and I want you to really start to evaluate, how can you really recognize that your parenting is very reactive, and start to prepare yourself for gauging how your emotion and your frustrations are dictating how you respond to your kids, and prepare yourself for wanting to start to shift that. I believe passionately, and so does the ranch, that our goal as parents should be that we're going to have healthy, functional adults. And when you create a punitive parenting approach, what you need to understand is that your kids, if they are compliant, are likely compliant because you are there. But the reality is, as they move into their older years and they're teenagers and they're going into college, you won't be there. And what you don't want is a child who only responds when they have a strong authoritative figure in their life. You want a child who has learned how to make decisions by being guided by those around them, and has learned to take personal responsibility. So again, if you're using a punitive parenting approach, you really need to understand that while it might work, it isn't transferable long term to your kids making really great decisions when you're not around. And so if you have identified during this video that this is your style, I just want to encourage you, don't be discouraged, don't be down on yourself, just be excited that you realize that there is a more effective way. And I would encourage you to give yourself grace as you pursue learning how to use the democratic approach instead of the punitive approach, because all change is hard, and at the end of the day, as parents, we want the best for our kids, and we want to engage with them and parent them in a way that's super effective. If you're watching this video, it means you care about having an effective approach. And so I'm just super excited that you took the time to tune in and to learn about this. Again, I do hope that you will check out the rest of this video series where I talk about the other parenting styles, and that it'll be really useful for you in working in your family towards more effective parenting and a style that's going to create healthy communication and great behavior outcomes for your kids, and really long-term healthy functional adults. Because as parents, that's what we're all really shooting for, is that we have kids that mature over time into healthy adults that can really thrive in society. So thanks again for tuning in. My name is Vicki Ellis, and I am the Executive Director of Heritage Ranch, and I appreciate you joining me.